Okay, so have you ever wondered if, like, with all our fancy technology and stuff, if we're actually better off than, like, our great-great-grandparents were?
It's a question people have been wrestling with for centuries.
Totally. And there's this book, Slouching Towards Utopia, by J. Bradford DeLong, and it dives deep into that question by, get this, looking at the economic history of the 20th century.
Oh, interesting. What's his take?
Well, he argues that during the 20th century, from 1870 to 2010, humanity got closer to utopia than ever before.
Really? So, like, we were on the right track.
Kind of, but not really. He says we didn't actually reach utopia.
Ah, I see. So what went wrong?
That's what this whole deep dive is going to unpack. But to kick things off, DeLong points to 1870 as this like major turning point. He says that's when things like industrial research labs started popping up, corporations were becoming these massive entities, and globalization was like exploding.
Right, those were huge forces reshaping the world.
Totally. And he says these forces all combined to create this like massive surge of economic growth, unlike anything we'd seen before.
Okay, but how do you measure something like that? Like, what does growth even look like in real terms?
Good point. DeLong uses something called the Global Knowledge Value Index as a way to measure technological progress. And get this, by 2010, this index was 21 times higher than it was in 1870.
21 times. Whoa, that's massive. What drove that kind of growth?
Well, he talks about a few things, but one of the big ones is this idea of comparative advantage.
Oh, right. The idea that even if a country isn't the absolute best at producing something, they can still benefit from global trade by focusing on what they're relatively good at.
Exactly. So it's not about being the best at everything. It's about specializing in what you do well and then trading with others who specialize in their own areas of expertise.
Yeah, it's like even if your phone's manufacturer isn't great at making every single component, they can still be really successful.
Right. They can focus on what they excel at, like design or software, and then trade for other parts like processors or screens from companies that specialize in those areas. And boom, you've got a top-of-the-line smartphone.
And this principle, this comparative advantage thing, that's what DeLong argues helped fuel global trade and ideally should have helped lift everyone up economically.
Yeah, at least in theory. But DeLong says that's not exactly how it played out.
Ooh, how so?
Well, while some parts of the world saw huge economic gains, other regions, especially India and China, didn't see the same level of what he calls the great enrichment.
Hmm. That is interesting, especially considering like India, under British rule at the time, seemed to have a lot of things working in its favor, right?
Exactly. Relatively peaceful, pretty decent governance, relatively low taxes. You'd think that would have been like the perfect recipe for economic growth.
It's a head scratcher. You'd think with those ingredients, they'd be set.
Yeah.
So what happened? Why didn't those regions see the same level of growth?
Well, DeLong argues that it was a combination of things.
Like what?
Well, political instability definitely played a role. But he also points to things like social structures that kind of stifled innovation and made it tough for new businesses to take off. Plus, in a lot of places, there just weren't enough skilled workers to really take advantage of all the new technologies that were popping up.
So it's like having the latest, greatest computer, but not knowing how to code. All that potential, but without the know-how, it's useless.
Exactly. It's this reminder that economic progress isn't just about technology or trade. It's about people, their skills, and the social and political systems they live in.
And sometimes those systems can really hold people back, even when the economic conditions seem just right.
Yeah.
It's like you can have all the right ingredients for something, but if you don't know how to combine them or if something's throwing you off, it's just not going to work.
Totally. And it makes me think about that Chinese reformer, Sun Yat-sen.
Oh, yeah. He was trying to, like, drag China into the modern world.
Right. Trying to modernize it, but kept running up against these like really deeply ingrained systems.
Yeah, the old guard wasn't having it.
Exactly.
Right.
Powerful forces resisting change. It makes you wonder if there were any points during the 20th century where it seemed like, okay, this is it. We're breaking free from these old patterns. We're actually on the road to utopia.
Well, DeLong definitely points to the period after World War II as this time of, like, incredible progress, especially in the West.
Oh, yeah, the post-war boom. Everyone always talks about how good things were back then.
Exactly. And DeLong calls this period the 30 glorious years of social democracy.
Okay, so what made this period so glorious? Was it just about, like, rebuilding after the war, or was there something more going on?
It was definitely more than just rebuilding. It was like this total mind shift when it came to thinking about how to run an economy.
Oh, interesting. So, like, what changed?
Well, for one thing, Keynesian economics started gaining some serious traction.
Keynesian economics. Remind me what that is again.
Right, so is this idea that governments should play an active role in managing the economy, using things like government spending and taxes to try to keep things stable.
So, like, instead of just letting the free market do its thing, governments were taking a more hands-on approach.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about government intervention either. Labor unions gained a ton of power during this time, fighting for workers' rights and making sure they got a fair share of all the economic growth that was happening.
So it was about making sure that everyone benefited, not just those at the top.
Exactly. It was about creating more just and equitable society.
Yeah.
And we also saw the rise of things like unemployment insurance, Social Security, universal health care in some places, things to like create a safety net for people if things went south.
So basically building a system where even if you hit a rough patch, you wouldn't fall through the cracks.
Exactly. It was all about trying to create a more stable and secure society for everyone. And, a great example of this is the Flint sit-down strike in 1937.
Oh, yeah. The auto workers strike. What was it in Michigan?
Yeah. These workers at General Motors, they literally took over the plant, refused to leave until their demands were met.
That's wild. They just sat down on the job.
They did. They sat down and said, we're not moving until things change. It was a really pivotal moment in labor history, and it eventually led to the Treaty of Detroit, this landmark agreement that basically set the standard for labor relations in the auto industry for decades.
Wow. So you have this period, the 30 glorious years, where things seem to be moving in the right direction, at least in the West. But then what happened? Why didn't it last?
Well, like all good things, it couldn't last forever. By the 1970s, some cracks started to show in this social democratic model.
Oh, no. What happened?
A bunch of things, actually. We saw rising inflation, productivity growth started to slow down, and then, bam, the oil crisis hit.
The 70s. Yeah, not exactly known as a shining beacon of economic stability, what with the stagflation and everything.
Right. And all of this really threw a wrench in the works for the social democratic model. This system that had been humming along so well suddenly seemed like it couldn't handle these new challenges.
So did people just lose faith? Like, did they just give up on the idea of social democracy?
In a way, yes. This is when a new set of ideas, championed by economists like Milton Friedman, started to gain a lot of traction.
Oh, right. This is the rise of neoliberalism.
Yeah, exactly. Friedman and other neoliberal thinkers were super critical of social democracy. They argued that all this government intervention, all these social programs, they were actually part of the problem, not the solution.
So their solution was to just let the market sort it out.
Pretty much. They believed that free markets, deregulation, less government interference, that was the key to unleashing economic growth and prosperity.
So this neoliberal turn, as they call it, this marked a pretty big shift in thinking.
Hugely. And it really set the stage for the next few decades of economic policy, not just in the West, but around the world. And DeLong argues that this shift, with its focus on things like free trade and deregulation, ushered in a whole new wave of globalization, even bigger and faster than what we saw back in the 1870s.
So globalization 2.0, and I'm assuming this new wave of globalization didn't solve all the world's problems.
You got it. It was a mixed bag. While some parts of the world thrived under this new model, others were left behind.
So not quite utopia then.
Not quite utopia.
Yeah.
DeLong points out that even with all this progress, all this globalization, millions of people around the world were still stuck in extreme poverty. And this unevenness, he argues, was due to a lot of factors.
Like what were some of the things that prevented certain regions from benefiting from this new wave of globalization?
Well, he argues that history plays a huge role. Things like colonialism and the slave trade left a lot of countries dealing with instability and inequality long after they gained independence.
Right. So it's like these historical injustices created roadblocks that made it much harder for some countries to develop.
Exactly. It's like trying to run a race with a 50-pound weight strapped to your back.
Yeah.
And DeLong points to sub-Saharan Africa as an example, a region that, despite efforts to modernize and join the global economy, continued to struggle with poverty.
And that makes me think about the story of Abubakar Tafawa Balewa.
Right.
Balewa, didn't he rise to become Nigeria's first prime minister? I feel like there was a whole thing about him going to London to study too.
He did. It's a really amazing story, actually. Born right at the start of British rule in Nigeria, became a teacher, went to London to study, and then ended up becoming Nigeria's first prime minister after they got independence.
Wow, talk about beating the odds.
Seriously. Shows what you can achieve even when you're up against some pretty big obstacles. But it's also like a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line.
How so?
Well, Balewa's life was cut short during a military coup, which just goes to show how fragile things like political stability can be, especially in countries that are still dealing with the after effects of colonialism.
It's a good point. It's like you can have these moments of incredible hope and progress, and then suddenly, boom, everything gets disrupted.
Exactly. And speaking of disruptions, DeLong argues that this is around the time when we see another major shift happening in the global economy, the rise of what he calls hyperglobalization.
Hyperglobalization. So we're talking about globalization on steroids.
Pretty much. It's the late 20th century, early 21st century, and globalization is kicking into overdrive thanks to things like the internet and the crazy amount of money flowing across borders. We're talking interconnected markets, instant communication, basically economic integration on a scale never seen before.
And this is where things start to go haywire, right? Leading up to the 2008 financial crisis.
Unfortunately, yes.
Hmm.
While hyperglobalization did create new opportunities for growth, it also came with a whole new set of risks.
Like what kind of risks are we talking about?
Well, a big one was this proliferation of these super complex financial instruments.
Oh, right, like those mortgage-backed securities we always hear about.
Exactly, and all these other weird and wonderful financial products that most people didn't even understand.
Hmm.
And the problem was, these things were basically bundles of loans, and a lot of those loans are really risky.
So it was like this house of cards ready to topple over at the slightest breeze.
Totally. And when the housing bubble in the U.S. burst, that was it. Game over. The whole system went into meltdown mode.
It's crazy to think that something that seemed so, like, abstract, these financial instruments, could have such a huge impact on the real world.
That's the thing about globalization, especially hyperglobalization. It's like this double-edged sword. It can connect us and create all these opportunities, but it can also make us more vulnerable to these kinds of global shocks.
So after this whirlwind tour through the 20th century, where does that leave us on this whole quest for utopia?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Mm.
And DeLong doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He just lays out this incredibly detailed and thought-provoking analysis of how we got to where we are today.
So are we just doomed to keep slouching towards utopia and never actually getting there?
I don't think that's necessarily his message. I think he's saying that progress is messy, it's complicated, there are always going to be setbacks and unintended consequences.
But there's still hope.
Definitely. But I think DeLong would say that we need to be smarter about how we pursue progress. We can't just focus on economic growth as the be-all and end-all. We need to think about things like sustainability, social justice, political stability, all those things that contribute to a genuinely good life.
So it's not just about getting richer as a society. It's about creating a world that's more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately more fulfilling for everyone.
Exactly. And that requires us to be more thoughtful, more critical, more willing to learn from our mistakes.
It's a tall order, but it's definitely a conversation worth having.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we've done a pretty good job of diving deep into DeLong's book today. It's given us a lot to think about.
It really has. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Keep those questions coming, and we'll catch you next time.